Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into a story that's pretty disturbing, to be honest. It's the case of Reginald McFadden.
Ah, Reginald McFadden. Now, this is a name that sends chills down your spine when you really dig into what he did.
Yeah, he's a convicted murderer who somehow managed to convince everyone he was rehabilitated, got paroled, and then, well, let's just say things took a very dark turn.
He went right back to his old ways, a truly tragic case that raises a lot of questions about the criminal justice system and the whole concept of rehabilitation.
For sure. I mean, we're talking about a guy who committed some truly horrific crimes. And what makes this deep dive particularly interesting is that we've got a ton of material to work with. Court documents, articles, even a prison interview with McFadden himself from years later.
Wow, a prison interview. I bet that was insightful. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start at the beginning. Where was McFadden born and what was his early life like?
Right, so Reginald McFadden was born in 1953 in Philadelphia, one of 10 children. His family was really struggling, living in poverty.
10 children. Wow, that's a lot of mouths to feed. No wonder they were struggling.
Yeah, and to make matters worse, his father wasn't around, and his mother's partner was, well, let's just say he wasn't a good guy. Incredibly abusive towards McFadden and his siblings.
Oh, that's awful. I can't imagine growing up in that kind of environment. It must have been incredibly traumatic for him.
Absolutely. The sources we have paint a pretty bleak picture of his childhood. He'd often try to escape the abuse by going to his grandmother's house, but it seems like the damage was already done. He ended up dropping out of school, got involved with gangs, and started committing petty crimes with his brothers.
So we're seeing that classic pattern of escalating trouble here, a troubled childhood leading to a life of crime. Sadly, it all culminated in a truly horrific event in December of 1969.
Yeah, this is where things get really dark. McFadden was only 16 years old at the time. He and three other guys broke into the apartment of a 66-year-old woman named Sonia Rosenbaum.
This is the case that landed him in prison for the first time, right?
It is. What they did to her is just, well, there's no other way to say it. It was brutal. They tied her up, gagged her, and just left her there to suffocate.
Oh my God, that's just heartless. They took her life for what? A few bucks?
It's crazy, right? They only stole $20 in her car. The brutality of it all, especially given their young age and the fact that they didn't even get away with much, it's just really disturbing.
It really makes you wonder what would drive teenagers to commit such a senseless act.
I know, right? Makes you think about how much someone's environment, their upbringing, can shape who they become. You can't help but wonder if things would have been different for him if he'd had a more stable, loving home life.
Sure, childhood experiences definitely play a role in shaping a person, but we can't just blame everything on a bad childhood, can we?
That's the age-old debate, right? Nature versus nurture.
Exactly. While a difficult childhood can make it more challenging to stay on the right path, ultimately, we all have to be held accountable for our choices. And in this case, McFadden's choices were horrifying.
Well, after this murder, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And at first, it seemed like he was continuing down that same dark path.
Oh, what do you mean?
He was getting into fights, causing trouble. Just seemed like he hadn't learned his lesson at all.
But then, wait, wasn't there some kind of transformation? I remember reading about that.
You're right. That's where things take an interesting turn. Prison records actually show that he went through a pretty significant personal change.
Like a real, genuine change?
It seems that way. He learned self-defense, started practicing religion, converted to Islam. He even participated in a bunch of those rehabilitation programs that prisons offer.
That's pretty remarkable. It sounds like he was really trying to turn his life around.
And he wasn't just going through the motions, he actually earned his high school diploma while he was inside, even started working towards some college degrees.
College degrees. What was he studying?
He dabbled in a few different things: psychology, tree surgery, even haircutting.
Wow, talk about a diverse range of interests. I guess that shows he was really trying to better himself. But this whole thing brings up a big question, doesn't it? Can a person really change while they're behind bars?
That's a question that people have been debating for ages. I mean, was this change in McFadden genuine, or was it all just an act? A way to manipulate the system and eventually get out of prison.
It's hard to say for sure. There's actually a lot of research on prison rehabilitation programs, but the results are kind of mixed. Some studies show that they can help reduce recidivism rates, but it really depends on the individual and the program itself.
So there's no easy answer then.
Nope, and it makes McFadden's case all the more fascinating, because it was this apparent transformation that ultimately led to him being paroled.
Right. So after nearly 8 years with a clean record in prison, his constant appeals for clemency were finally granted.
Clemency. Just to clarify for our listeners, can you explain what a clemency petition is?
Sure, it's basically a formal request to reduce or change a sentence. And in McFadden's case, he was petitioning for his life sentence to be commuted so he could be eligible for parole.
I see. And it sounds like he had quite a few people in his corner, too. You mentioned that he had positive reports from prison staff and psychologists.
Yeah, and there were actually 5 volunteers who were willing to vouch for him. They offered to give him housing and help him find a job in New York once he got out. All of that played a role in the parole board's decision.
It sounds like they really thought he had turned over a new leaf.
They did. But here's the thing. They made that decision based solely on what was in front of them on paper. You know, they never actually met McFadden face to face.
Wow. That seems like a pretty big risk, considering his past.
It was a gamble, that's for sure.
And a gamble that, unfortunately, had devastating consequences.
Yeah, granting parole to someone who committed such a brutal crime, even if they seem to have changed, is always a risk. And in McFadden's case, that risk didn't pay off.
So McFadden is a free man, given this second chance at life after spending years behind bars. But the sources we have, they tell a different story about what happened next.
It's like he put on this act of being reformed, got what he wanted, and then just snapped back to his old self.
It really does make you question everything we thought we knew about his supposed rehabilitation.
Doesn't. And it only took 3 months for his true colors to show.
3 months. That's all it took for him to commit another violent crime.
On September 6, 1994, he kidnapped a 55-year-old woman, Jeremy Brown.
And this was no petty crime. We're talking about a terrifying ordeal for this woman.
Absolutely. McFadden held her captive for 5 hours. 5 hours. He beat her, he repeatedly raped her, even forced her to take money out of ATMs for him.
God, that poor woman. It's unimaginable what she went through.
And get this, according to her testimony, he only decided to let her go because he found out she worked as an alcoholism counselor.
Seriously? What kind of logic is that?
I know, right? It's chilling. Like, he somehow thought that her profession made her worthy of mercy or something.
Or maybe he was just worried about the consequences if he hurt someone in that line of work.
Maybe. But either way, it just shows how distorted his thinking was. And sadly, his violence didn't stop with Jeremy Brown.
You're talking about Margaret Keir.
Yes, Margaret Keir. Just a few weeks later, on September 27th, he attacked her. She was 78 years old.
This time, McFadden didn't show any mercy.
He raped her, murdered her, robbed her, and just left her body there.
It's like his crimes were getting more and more brutal.
And just when you think it can't get any worse, on October 1st, he strikes again. This time, the victim was 42-year-old Robert Silk.
Another senseless murder. Did he steal from Silk as well?
Yep. Stole his car and his credit cards.
It's just horrifying. And what's even more disturbing is that there's no clear pattern here, you know? His victims were all different ages, different backgrounds, lived in different areas.
It makes you wonder, what was driving him? Was it pure rage? Some twisted need for control? Or did he just not care about human life at all?
It's a question that haunts everyone involved in this case. What could possibly have pushed him to commit such horrific acts?
It's a question without an easy answer. But thankfully, this reign of terror didn't last forever.
He was eventually caught, right?
Yes. On October 6, 1994, McFadden was finally arrested in Rockland County, New York.
What led to his arrest?
Well, authorities had been building a case against him, connecting him to Silk's disappearance and Brown's kidnapping.
So it was the earlier crimes that eventually caught up with him.
Exactly. And his arrest led to even more horrifying discoveries.
You mean Robert Silk's body?
Yeah. Months after Silk went missing, his remains were found in a creek.
It must have been devastating for Silk's family to finally get that confirmation.
Absolutely. But at least it meant that McFadden could be officially charged with Silk's murder. So now he's facing multiple charges for these horrific crimes.
What happened next? Did he go straight to trial?
Well, the first trial was for the kidnapping and rape of Jeremy Brown. That started in August of 1995. And get this, he decided to represent himself in court.
Wow, he represented himself. That's a bold move.
It was a huge gamble, and probably not a very smart one. During the trial, Brown took the stand, faced her attacker, and gave a powerful testimony.
I can only imagine how difficult that must have been for her.
She was incredibly brave. What about McFadden? What was his defense?
Oh, he insisted he was innocent. Claimed that the jewelry the police found in his apartment, which belonged to Brown, had actually been given to him by some Muslim friends.
As if the jury would believe that.
Yeah, that's pretty flimsy. And not surprisingly, the jury saw right through his lies. They found him guilty. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison.
Wow, 70 years, that's a long time.
It is, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. He still had to face trials for the murders of Margaret Keir and Robert Silk.
So what happened in those trials?
Well, for Keir's murder, he actually pleaded guilty. But he tried to downplay his actions, said that he had attacked her in a moment of rage after getting lost.
Sounds like another excuse to avoid taking full responsibility.
It does, doesn't it? But when it came to Silk's murder, he went with a completely different story. Claimed he acted in self-defense.
Self-defense. How did he explain that one?
He said that Silk had made unwanted sexual advances towards him.
But there was no evidence to support that claim at all.
Nope, none whatsoever. It seems pretty obvious that he was just grasping at straws, trying anything to avoid another life sentence.
And did the jury believe him?
No way. They saw through his lies and convicted him of Silk's murder. He was given another life sentence on top of the 70 years he was already serving.
So in the end, he ended up right back where he started, behind bars for the rest of his life.
It's a tragic end to a truly horrifying story. But McFadden's crimes had a huge impact that went way beyond just his own life.
You're talking about the impact on the criminal justice system.
Exactly. His case sent shockwaves through the system. Here was a man who everyone thought was rehabilitated. He was granted parole, given a second chance, and then, within months, he committed these horrific acts.
It forced people to take a hard look at the whole idea of parole, the effectiveness of rehabilitation programs, and whether we can really trust that someone is truly changed while they're in prison.
It exposed some serious weaknesses in the system. Remember, the parole board granted McFadden parole without ever even meeting him in person.
Yeah, that seems like a huge oversight in retrospect.
It was a major contributing factor to this whole tragedy. And there was a massive public outcry after McFadden's crimes came to light. People wanted to know how this could have happened. How did a man with his history manage to slip through the cracks?
It was a huge scandal. And what about those 5 volunteers who had agreed to support McFadden after he was released? They must have felt incredibly betrayed.
You can't help but wonder what was going through their minds when they learned what he had done. He's a complicated situation, this question of responsibility and whether they could have done anything differently.
Well, at least some good came out of this terrible situation.
You're talking about the reforms that were implemented after McFadden's crimes?
Yes. McFadden's case sparked a massive push for change. Both Pennsylvania and New York ended up enacting much stricter parole guidelines. The focus shifted to more thorough risk assessments and closer monitoring of parolees after they're released.
It was a huge step towards greater accountability and transparency within the parole system.
It's heartbreaking that it took such a horrible series of events to make those changes happen.
It really highlights how important it is to constantly evaluate and improve our systems, to learn from our mistakes and try to prevent future tragedies.
But there's another aspect to this case that we haven't touched on yet. Remember, McFadden was only 16 when he committed that first murder.
Right, the Sonia Rosenbaum case.
And that brings up a whole other set of questions about juvenile rehabilitation.
Questions that are incredibly difficult to answer. Can a young person who commits a violent crime ever truly be rehabilitated? How do we balance the need for punishment with the possibility of redemption, especially when dealing with young offenders?
There are no easy answers, but McFadden's case certainly adds fuel to that debate. It makes us question what we can really do to prevent young people from going down a path of violence and destruction.
It's a reminder that we need to keep looking for ways to address the root causes of crime and find effective ways to rehabilitate those who have committed offenses, especially when they're still young.
This deep dive into Reginald McFadden's life and crimes has been, well, it's been intense to say the least. We've gone from the absolute horror of his crimes to the hope that maybe he had changed, only to realize that it was all just a facade.
It's a story that really makes you question human nature.
And it leaves us with this nagging question. Did McFadden ever truly feel any remorse for what he did?
We do have access to a prison interview with McFadden that was conducted in 2009. Maybe his own words can shed some light on that question.
That's right. We'll be diving into that interview in part 3 of this deep dive. It's a fascinating look into his mind, years after he committed these terrible crimes. All right, so we're now looking at this 2009 interview with McFadden. He's 56 years old, been in prison for a long time at this point. What's his take on, well, everything that's happened?
Well, one of the first things that jumps out is how he talks about his first murder, Sonia Rosenbaum's murder, back when he was a teenager. He kind of downplays it,
Downplays it how?
He claims it was an accident, says he should have been convicted of manslaughter, not murder.
So even now, all these years later, he's still trying to minimize what he did.
It's hard to tell if he truly believes that or if he's just trying to make himself look better. But then, when asked about Robert Silk's murder, he goes with a completely different story.
Oh yeah, Silk. What's he saying about that one?
Claims self-defense, says Silk assaulted him.
Self-defense? Come on. That just doesn't add up with the evidence.
Right, and it contradicts what he said at the trial. Seems like he's just trying to come up with any excuse to avoid taking responsibility.
It's a pattern with him, isn't it? Always blaming others, refusing to own up to his actions.
It is, but perhaps the most disturbing part of this whole interview is when he starts talking about his beliefs.
Uh-oh. What kind of beliefs are we talking about?
Well, he calls himself a black supremacist, says he's a danger to society.
Wow, that's chillin'. Almost like he's proud of his capacity for violence.
It makes you wonder, was he being sincere? Or was this some kind of calculated attempt to create this image of himself as a dangerous, powerful figure?
I mean, it's impossible to know for sure what was going on in his head, but either way, it's a scary thought.
It is, and it raises the question, Could there be other victims out there, ones we don't even know about?
Well, McFadden was a suspect in the death of Dana Blaze DeMarco. Her body was found near the Garden State Parkway, and that was around the same time as his other crimes, late 1994.
Right, and they never could definitively prove that he was responsible, but a lot of the evidence pointed to him.
And let's not forget about all that jewelry that was found in his apartment, stuff that couldn't be linked to any of his known victims.
It's a disturbing thought, right? The possibility that there might be other families out there who still don't have answers about what happened to their loved ones.
McFadden's case is full of those unsettling what-ifs. It's like every time you think you've reached the bottom of this dark well, you realize it goes even deeper.
It's a case that really sticks with you. We've gone from the horror of his crimes to this brief glimmer of hope that maybe he had changed, only to have that hope crushed by his actions, and then these chilling statements from the prison interview.
So where does that leave us? What can we really take away from this whole deep dive into Reginald McFadden's life and crimes?
Well, for me, it's a stark reminder that the human mind is incredibly complex, capable of both great change and terrible darkness. McFadden's story, it forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions about justice, rehabilitation, and how we can truly protect society from individuals like him.
It also highlights how important it is to be critical of information, to not just take things at face value, but to really dig deeper, consider different perspectives, and question motives.
Absolutely. Especially when dealing with someone like McFadden, who clearly had a talent for manipulation and deception. We have to remember that everyone has an agenda, and we should always be wary of those who claim to have all the answers.
Well said. I think that's a good note to end on. This deep dive into Reginald McFadden's life and crimes has been a heavy one. But it's a story that I think deserves to be told, and it's a story that I hope will stay with our listeners long after they finish listening.
I agree, and I hope it inspires people to keep asking questions, to keep learning, and to never stop seeking the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll be back soon with another one, exploring a new topic and uncovering more hidden truths. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.